Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. The second type of opposition that Aristotle distinguishes in Categories, Book 10, is what we call Contrariness or Contraries, enantia. This is a stronger form of opposition than just being opposed to each other. This is when things really are contrary, opposites, you could say, in a very rigorous sense of the term. And Aristotle wants to stress to us that these terms are not correlative to each other. Correlation was the first form of opposition that he points out. And he says, look, when you have terms like good or bad or black and white, it's not as if the good is the good of the bad, where it has its meaning in relation to the bad, and lacking the bad, there's no sense of goodness. As a matter of fact, you could imagine a world in which everything was indeed completely good. Whether you can imagine a world that's totally bad, probably not, given some of the other things that Aristotle says about badness. But you can certainly imagine a world in which everything is totally good. So good and bad are not terms like double and half, or to use another example, master and servant, or father and son, that he has put under the category of relation, to prosti. Instead, these are opposed to each other. Bad is the opposite of good. Good is the opposite of bad. And this is a fundamental part of Aristotle's metaphysical schema. So somebody may object, well, you can't know goodness without knowing badness. Aristotle doesn't actually think that. And I should point out here as well that the type of opposition that is involved in contrariness is also different, Aristotle will point out, than the third form of opposition, which is that between hexis and staresis, or positive and privation. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's also not the same thing as affirmation, kataphasis, and denial, apophasis, because those have to do with language, and this has to do with the qualities, the things that we can say are in a thing, and that we can use terms to predicate of a thing. So that's an important point. Now, what we really want to get to talking about here is this interesting discussion about intermediaries and not having intermediaries. And that's going to have to do with the kinds of contrariness that we're seeing in certain terms and in certain subjects. So Aristotle will say that some contraries are naturally found in their subjects. What does he mean by that? He means that a subject, a given subject, has to have either this one or that one. And there are many subjects that don't have that. So let's take, instead of using the health and disease example, let's start with the first example that might be more illuminating because it's a little bit simpler. Numbers, right? Numbers, according to Aristotle, and put aside what we know about modern mathematics with square roots and imaginary numbers and stuff like that, Aristotle says that numbers must either be even or odd, one or the other. And you might say, wait a second, what about zero? Well, Aristotle didn't have zero. That came in mathematics later on from Indian mathematics long after Aristotle's time. So if we go by the understanding of number that Aristotle has at the time, what we can call the cardinal numbers, he's actually right. Either even or odd, one or the other. And, if a number were to change, I suppose, which numbers themselves can't for Aristotle, it would have to go from being even to being odd, or odd to being even. And it's either one or the other. Now let's take something that actually does change. Aristotle talks about health and disease. Numbers don't have health and disease, right? Just as bodies don't have evenness or oddness, except insofar as you're counting them or something like that. But bodies, living bodies, are either healthy or diseased. And Aristotle says it's either one or the other. Now, you could object to him and say, well, perhaps it's healthy in this respect, but diseased in this respect. Okay, now you're bringing in qualifications, and you're going a little bit beyond the discussion that he's engaging in. He's talking about overall. Overall, a body is healthy or a body is diseased. You might say, well, isn't there like a continuum between them? Aristotle says, look, health is when the body is all properly functioning, and we could lay down some probably fairly arbitrary limits about everything on this side counts as healthy, everything on this side counts as diseased, and we could say, okay, more healthy or more diseased, but there's a dividing line between the two of them, and at a certain point you cross over into being diseased, or you cross back into being healthy. So you're either one or the other. Now, other things, like a piece of chalk, neither healthy nor diseased. We might say other things about that, like straight or bent, right? That's another example of that sort that Aristotle uses. So he says there are no intermediaries for these. When it comes to numbers, there's nothing in between odd and even, right? When it comes to bodies and living tissues, either they're healthy or they're diseased. When it comes to objects, either they're straight or they're crooked. Pick one or pick the other. It gets much more interesting when we get to the ones, Aristotle says, contraries that do have intermediates. So what would be some examples of those? I've put several of the ones that he uses up on the board. He talks, for example, about colors. And he uses this quite frequently here in the categories. And on this, we actually have some other texts that give us a bit more information about this. Aristotle sees black and white as existing on a spectrum where black is at one end and white is at the other, and they are opposites to each other. Now, bodies can be black or they can be white. For example, this chalk is white, and although this shirt is not, black, it's actually a dark blue. Let's just pretend it's black for a moment, because I could have put on a black shirt today. Or, great example, this recording device is indeed black. Now, there's no internal necessity that says that, for example, this recording device must be black. As a matter of fact, it could come in whatever color we want because it's plastic and we can dye it whatever color. The dyes, on the other hand, the substances that we use for dyeing, they are that particular color. And if we think about not, the sort of chemical things that we do today, which are very sophisticated, but we think about the dyes that and pigmentations that they would have had available at the time. If you grind up lapis lazuli for blue, it's just going to be blue, and that's it. That's not going to be a different color. If you grind up ochre for a brownish or yellowish, that's going to be that color. If you take shellfish and extract the purple dye from them so you can dye your tunic purple, that's that color, right? If you wash your tunic so that it becomes white, dazzlingly white, as white as we could get at that time, that's that. And the chalk itself presumably is naturally this color. I don't really know when it comes to chalk. Most of the chalk that I've seen is white, and I assume that the other stuff has been dyed. But black and white exist on a continuum. Nothing needs to be necessarily black or white unless it's that sort of thing that automatically has that color. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And then there's an entire spectrum in between, intermediaries. So we could talk about an intermediary where it's partly black and partly white, like gray, or we could talk about other colors. And this is how Aristotle conceives of color working in for example, on Sense and the Sensible, or in On the Soul. Yellow would be an example of another color. Red, green. We could go on and on and on about this sort of thing. What about other things? Good versus bad. Okay, so here Aristotle says we don't really have a middling term. We just say neither good nor bad, but it's not the case that for any given person they are necessarily either good or bad. They could be somewhere in the middle. And this is, in fact, how Aristotle conceives of ethics working. We try to steer ourselves away from the bad and towards the good, and we try to steer other people, like children that we're in charge of, in similar ways. Just versus unjust. It's also possible to be neither just nor unjust, in the sense of not, having the virtue of justice or the vice of injustice, but it's being somewhere in between. And Aristotle says sometimes we have a word for this, sometimes we have to make up words for this sort of thing. Another one that he gives is an example of one of these that's on a continuum and has intermediaries, coldness versus heat, right? You could say, well, look, either something is cold or it's hot. It's either one or the other. No, there's lukewarm in the middle, right? And so there's a set of intermediaries that are possible. Now, Aristotle says something else that's very interesting about this a little bit further on when he's talking about intermediaries. He says, when contraries have no intermediate, like the case of health or sickness, we saw that the one or the other must ever be present in the subject in which they are naturally found, or of which they will serve as the predicate. So, odd and even are naturally found or serve as predicates in numbers, but do not, do that with say, articles of clothing, except in a derivative sense that we've already talked about in the quantity chapter. He says, where this necessity obtained, those terms could have no intermediates. Health and disease, odd and even, were mentioned as examples. But where contraries have an intermediate, no such necessity obtains. It is not every subject that may be receptive of black and white that must therefore be black or be white. The fact that something could be black or could be white doesn't mean that it has to be either black or white. But if something can admit of health or disease, then it must admit of one or the other, and there is no middle ground. Now, it goes on a little bit further, and he says, he gives two examples that are particularly interesting with respect to color and with respect to heat. So he says, an exception must be made where one contrary naturally inheres, where it's naturally found in that thing, right? Where it is present, you could say. And he gives examples like fire. To be hot is the nature of fire. So although in other bodies there could be a gradation, and of course, we could talk about one fire being hotter than another fire, a fire has to be hot, according to Aristotle, or there's no fire. That's part of the nature of the fiery thing. Likewise, he says it's the nature of snow to be white. Presumably, it would be the nature of snow to be cold, too, as well. But it's the nature of snow to be white. In such cases, one of the contraries needs must be definitely present, not one or the other in things. It's out of the question that fire should be cold or that snow should be black. And, of course, you could object, well, wait a second, what about yellow snow? Well, yellow snow, presumably, is snow that has an admixture of something else that is making it yellow. Or what about red snow? We get Kool-Aid and we sprinkle it on the snow, maybe writing our name or something like that. Okay, the Kool-Aid is red. The snow is actually white. Yes, but what about black ice, where the snow gets packed down at the tops of mountains and then eventually becomes, this very dark thing, which, by the way, is the real meaning of black ice. It's not what people in the South started talking about as ice on a blacktop. Black ice is actually what's found at the tops of, say, the Alps, for example. Well, what's going on there, it's not that the snow itself is becoming black, it's being transformed into something different, presumably. But these objections can be handled pretty easily. The basic idea is that there are certain things that are automatically going to have a quality. If we wanted to use another example of this, something that's quite similar to the color range that Aristotle talks about, taste, right? Some things are sweet, and sweet is at one extreme. Bitter is at another extreme, and then we have all sorts of things in between. Aristotle actually distinguishes 8 fundamental flavor profiles. The fatty or the oily is closer to the sweet. The salty is closer to the bitter. There are some things that are bitter by their very nature, and there are some things that are sweet by their very composition. So, to talk about bitter sugar, Aristotle would say that's really nonsensical. It's not going to have that property. You could add something else to the sugar, like almond extract or orange peel, to give it some bitterness, right? But it's not going to be bitter by itself. So some of these opposed qualities admit of intermediaries. Some of them don't. We see now what the reasons for that are in Aristotle, and this is a fundamental type of opposition for Aristotle.